Hi, I'm Margaret McAllen, Director of Special Projects at the Whitty Museum. Thank you for joining us for our third annual conference on Texas. This year's theme is particularly in tune with what we're facing during this COVID-19 time. The theme is resilience, past, present, and future. Today we're here to talk about crushing Texas justice, the all-girl bands at Huntsville, particularly a farm called Goree Farm, related to the Huntsville prison. Our speaker today is Caroline Gnagy. She's a musician and historian based in Austin, Texas. She's the author of Texas Jailhouse Music, A Prison Band History. Other works appear in the Oxford Handbook of Country Music, edited by Travis Steinling, Country Boys and Redneck Women, edited by Christine McCusker and Diane Pecknold, and the Handbook of Texas Music, second edition, edited by Laurie Jasinski, very much a fan of the Texas State Historical Association Press. Ms. Gnagy is currently working on her second book about the lives and careers of female rockabilly performers from pioneers to the present day. She also continues her research into prison bands in Texas and beyond. So welcome, Caroline. It's a pleasure to have you and your presentation today.
Thanks so much, Mary Margaret. I really am honored to be part of this fantastic conference, and I was bummed out when we had to postpone, but I'm really glad that we're able to do something here today for all the attendees. Okay, so I am going to start. My paper is about the Goree all-girl string band at the Huntsville and Goree units of the Texas prison system in the early 1940s, late 1930s and early 1940s. I'll just go ahead. I have it. I'm going to be reading, but I just want everybody to know that we will be available for questions, and I will probably interject with some comments as I go, because there's a lot of interesting aspects to this story. Okay, so in the years between the World Wars, the rise of popular music and public service radio merged with Progressive era and later New Deal era inspired changes in the notoriously brutal Texas prison system, culminating in an award-winning radio show entitled 30 Minutes Behind the Walls. The popularity of this radio show and the effect it had on both listeners and performers alike was a phenomenon in the already unique story of the Texas prison system. With 30 Minutes Behind the Walls, Texas public officials employed radio through the lure of popular music and its familiar themes of patriotism, sentimentality, home sweet home, and other aspects that are palatable as a public relations tool to communicate their political and social attitudes to hundreds of thousands of Americans in the throes of hardship in the Great Depression. The success of 30 Minutes Behind the Walls, hereafter I'm going to refer to it as just 30 minutes, could perhaps be attributed to the aforementioned choice of songs, or by some even perhaps into the uplifting speeches by public officials appearing on the show, ranging from the prison shop print manager, the print shop manager, to various governors of Texas. But the most intriguing aspect of 30 Minutes to the listener was probably the performers. All were inmates at the Texas State Penitentiary, men and women who were serving years-long sentences for crimes like cattle rustling, auto and livestock theft, robbery, and murder. These men and women who we are going to talk about today, in particular about how they took these often harsh sentences and overcame them somewhat, the justice that had been laid on them through music. Through their acquiescence and willingness to perform for the public and transmission via radio waves, what was described as an abundance of talent, these boys and girls in white were often able to reclaim their freedom. Now, the appeal of the radio show leading up into the New Deal era has been well documented. Scholars like Susan Smulyan did a book called Selling Radio, The Commercialization of American Broadcasting, 1920 to 34. She captures quite a lot of information about radio during the New Deal era, which plays very significantly into this story. The 1929 stock market crash and the subsequent suppression elevated, of course, the battery-operated radio to premier status as the primary, most inexpensive form of entertainment for countless poor families in the U.S. Widespread radio use by the general public also resulted in increased public and governmental support, funding, for many programs, including those for prison reform and rehabilitation of the inmates. And industry magazine reports from 1930 onward indicated that radio programs containing information on prisons and inmates, the prisoner's plight, so to speak, and prisoner interviews occurred in a number of states across the Northeast and the Midwest, as well as the South and Mid-Atlantic. Justice officials took note and believed a radio show, a vibrant, successful radio show, might be the ticket to save what they felt was at stake, the reputation of the Texas prison system. Well, brutality. This is what the Texas prison system has always been known for. I hope I don't make too many enemies by saying that, but what can you do? And it's one of the reasons why this story is so compelling. A successful radio show coming from the home of the Black Mariah and Old Sparky the electric chair, it's completely uncharacteristic of a system that is also known for being one of, if not the most, bloodthirsty and unsympathetic in the nation. It's called Texas Tough, as Dan Perkinson said, not just historically, but in the present day as well. But even as early as Texas Governor Dan Moody's administration in the late 1920s, Texas began to take steps toward modernization of the antiquated prison system. And in 1930, board member Lee Simmons was appointed general manager of the Texas prison system, and he set about making changes to increase public support for his agenda and improve conditions in the Texas prison, although not necessarily the conditions of the inmate, as his managerial style was decidedly controversial due to his avowal that the bat was a perfectly viable form of punishment for the inmates. His stance never changed, even though the Texas Prison Board voted to abolish the use of the bat in the 1930s. From a public relations perspective, the first successful and most enduring endeavor credited to Simmons was the Texas Prison Rodeo in the early 1930s. The event had taken place informally at the branch unit Eastham Prison Farm for 2 years before Simmons expanded on the concept and moved the event to the main Texas prison at Huntsville, also known as the Walls, where its debut occurred in 1931. Noted penology scholar Ethan Bloom described the sensationalized wording in the rodeo's souvenir programs as evocative of, quote, an Anglo-Texan memory of the American West steeped in the lore of the open frontier, unquote, which of course meant that the rodeo was a smash hit with the American public, who were long enthralled by the open frontier's autonomous and wild mystique. By the late 1930s, thousands of spectators attended the rodeo, which also served as a natural venue for Western-themed songs performed by both male and female hillbilly string bands, songs and bands that would later feature most heavily on 30 Minutes. Both inmates performed and people from the outer world performed. Despite the popularity of the rodeo, however, the 1930s continued to bring reports of rampant inhumane cruelty to inmates, forcing them into backbreaking work from can see to can't, and resulting in an increased self-mutilization, even amputations by some inmates. The Texas Prison Board was desperate for improvement of this unflattering and brutal public image, and they determined that radio provided a most advantageous avenue by broadcasting to an enormous audience, bringing their agenda to the forefront via the down-home appeal of an amateur radio show. So let's talk a little bit about this radio show. 30 Minutes Behind the Walls began in 1938 in March as a live radio broadcast from inside the walls themselves. Featuring inmates and public officials, 30 Minutes aired through the US, Canada, and Mexico every Wednesday night at 10:30 p.m. on Fort Worth radio station WBAP. Now, on the surface, the show represented the popular barn dance programs of the era, like WLS's National Barn Dance or amateur variety hours, such as Major Bo's The Amateur Hour, the original Amateur Hour. I have an uncle who was on that show for a while. Beneath the surface, the program was carefully orchestrated, though. and I do mean orchestrated, pardon the pun, at times more so than the bands that played on it, and served as a wide-reaching platform for the image rehabilitation of Texas government systems. Public officials spoke eloquently and hopefully of modernization, rehabilitation, and the plight of the unfortunate, forgotten, and certainly remorseful boys and girls in white, as they were euphemistically referred to. These boys and girls, seldom publicly referred to collectively or separately as men or women, were entirely responsible for the broadcast, from preparation to publicity to production to performance, and much work went into creating the show each week. The prison newspaper, the Texas Prison Echo, reported that the cast of the show rehearsed nightly and most of the day each Wednesday. Prior to each week's broadcast, a free live performance by the inmates was put on for the public at an auditorium within the prison walls. The doors swung open at 9:30 p.m. and the live floor show started at 10, and it featured many of the inmates who would appear on the show a short time later. The in-person attendance at these live performances averaged from 300 to 400 attendees, with as many as 900 for some of their particular shows. People traveled for hundreds of miles to see the floor show, satisfy their curiosity about life inside the prison. We have a visitor behind me. Apologies for that. The in-person attendance at these shows. Okay, so people traveled for hundreds of miles to see the floor show, satisfy their curiosity about life inside the prison walls, and get a glimpse of the inmate performers who they heard on the air each week. After its inaugural broadcast, the show received over 1,000 cards and letters and had an estimated 5 million listeners at its peak, and received thousands of fan letters and requests each subsequent week. One episode challenged the audience to write in requesting their yearly anniversary show to be extended to a full hour, and reported receiving letters in excess of 220,000 the following week. Sorry, that was funny. Soon after, Broadcasting Magazine took note, and in 1941, 30 Minutes received a Peabody Award for recognition for its public service. And so let's talk a little bit about the music. 30 Minutes featured not only the aforementioned hillbilly music, but a grab bag of popular genres of the time. Patriotic songs, blues, swing, jazz, pop, Hawaiian, hymns, and instrumentals of any genre. An early example of racial integration in radio, inmates of all races participated in the broadcast. And on-air interviews were conducted with representatives of each race as well. Although 30 Minutes did display a clear racial hierarchy within the show's format, the music itself was another matter. On 30 Minutes Behind the Walls, African-American inmates played white songs, although rarely cowboy songs, and similarly, sometimes the white musicians played blues, jazz, or even older gospel songs mainly known to the African-American population. The music and its performers portrayed was a true melding of cultures, and as the series progressed, the number of African-American inmate participants increased. The Glee Club group sometimes performed as choral ensembles of male inmates, such as the Negro Quartet is what they called them, and various gospel groups and duos with other names that varied from episode to episode. Appearing much less frequently than their male counterparts, African-American female inmates also performed as duos and quartets, nearly always singing gospel songs. The primary exception to this was female African-American vocalist Hattie Ellis. Already a popular act on the prison rodeo, Hattie Ellis also performed on the show as a featured vocal soloist. And even better, we can hear her. This is one clip that I have that I'm going to play here for everybody to hear, and I hope you enjoy it. I'm going to explain in a little bit why we don't have recordings of a lot of these others, but here is one that we can do for you.
Crossing a desert, on my way back home again. Crossing a desert, on my way back home again. Well, I'm ragged and I'm dirty, ooh Lord, I'm even cold in hand. away. Wonder where can my baby be? I wonder if you stay away or if you come back to me. I'm gonna walk, I'm gonna ride until I reach that deep sea. I'm gonna walk, I'm gonna ride until I reach that deep sea. Then I'm gonna throw away my trouble, ooh Lord, and all my misery. Ooh, goodbye. You may never see me no more. Ooh, goodbye. You may never see me no more. But if you see my baby, ooh Lord, just tell him I had to go.
Something else, huh? I think that song is really great. Apparently she wrote it, or she said she wrote it. It's a phenomenal song in many ways, and I have never heard it anywhere else. So I'm thinking she might have been true about that. She might have been being, she might have written it. Okay, so Hattie Ellis was perhaps one of the most well-documented early female stars of 30 Minutes, and she was already a star on the show by the time that legendary scholar and folklorist John Avery Lomax and his wife, Ruby Lomax, came to the penitentiary on their 1939 Southern States recording trip. Hattie Ellis recorded 4 songs for their collection. Although most of the inmates who sang with Ellis on these recordings were African American, one exception stood out. A member of the Rhythmic Stringsters, cowboy and guitar player, Cowboy Jack Ramsey, provided guitar accompaniment for Ellis on the 2 recordings where she sang lead. This unique example of inmate musical integration is possibly the only penitentiary recording that Dr. Lomax ever made in which a white convict was featured, or at the very least credited, even as an accompanist. When it came to recording in prisons, Lomax emphatically stated that he intentionally chose to concentrate solely on folk music and work songs of the African American inmate population. So as an unfortunate result, their Southern State song collections resulted in no other capture of music within the white, Mexican, or any other non-African American population of Texas prisons in the 1930s. We are incredibly grateful for the contributions that Lomax did. But we also know for a fact that accomplished songwriters resided within the walls, and omissions of this type meant that the inmates' original compositions were never recorded. Also unfortunate is that the Lomax's forays into the prisons set a powerful precedence for future song collectors. So everybody that came after him, almost no recordings of non-African American convicts within Southern penitentiaries were collected in later decades either. And furthermore, although the first several years of 30 Minutes episodes were transcribed and bound into a single publication of broadcasts, no recordings or video footage of the 30 Minutes airings on WBAP have ever been discovered. So Hattie's incredible haunting voice is all we have that really remains from that time and place. So I'm going to switch gears here because I want to talk a little bit about the prison in which these inmates were working out of, doing their music. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the music and the musicians. We have Peabody Awards, as I mentioned earlier, a hugely popular rodeo and the early 20th century version of a virally popular radio show in which penitent male and female inmates of all races sang popular and sentimental songs. And in interviews, they extolled the virtues of having seen the error of their ways. But as the radio show continued to gain popularity and win awards, and the rodeo thrilled tens of thousands of people each season, so continued the omnipresent brutality of the 1930s Texas prison system, not only for the nearly 6,000 incarcerated men, but also for the few incarcerated women as well. All female inmates of the Texas prison system resided at one location, the Goree State Farm for Women, located near the Huntsville facility. This population averaged about 150 in the 1930s, in the late 1930s. And there can be no doubt that as far as punitive events are concerned, the women definitely had an easier time of it than the men on a day-to-day level. However, the women dealt with the consequences of their incarceration that was far longer lasting than like 6 hours on the barrel or 20 hours in the hole. For example, involuntary sterilization. I'm sure there's going to be more questions about that. I would like to talk in detail about that if we have questions. But here I'd like to present an account that, although thankfully not involving involuntary sterilization of this particular inmate, it gives us a pretty visceral perspective on what the female inmates dealt with upon arrival at the Goree unit of the Texas State Prison. So on October 6, 1937, a young woman identified as convict 86388 was entered into the prison system. Her name was Dorothy Thompson, 29, 5 feet 6 inches tall, dark blue eyes, auburn hair, and serving a two-year sentence for a forgery conviction. As a woman being entered into the Texas prison system in the 1930s, we can say her experience would be considered typical. Dorothy was brought into the Huntsville unit intake and fingerprinted by Ace High, apparently good-looking tall male convict. Her mugshot was taken and entered into the prison ledgers, and then she was loaded into the front seat of the prison van with a guard behind her and brought to Goree Farm. After Thompson arrived at Goree, she was given a medical examination, vaccinated, and tested for syphilis. And only after receipt of a negative result would she be allowed to bunk with the general population. Women with venereal diseases were confined to a single dormitory, so they put them there first. Mrs. Heath, wife of the prison manager and also the Goree prison matron, confiscated her few allowed belongings, and I said allowed, her few allowed belongings, and ordered for a delousing for the new convict through a harsh application of coal oil, during which the new inmate complained bitterly at the treatment. Her dissent during the delousing process led to retaliation from the prison manager, Captain Heath. That evening, Heath called for the new prisoner and told her that he heard she was being a bully and that bullies were not tolerated in this prison, and how dare she have spoken to Mrs. Heath in such a manner. At his behest, Thompson's long hair was cut off against her will, and Captain Heath even threatened to shave her hair off entirely. He asked Mrs. Heath if she wanted him to do so, and she stated that she thought an apology would be sufficient. Thompson apologized and attempted to shake hands on the matter, but was told, "We don't shake hands with prisoners, and you ain't nobody to us now." Understandably, those who oversaw the Goree unit of the Texas State Prison felt they needed to enforce their authority to any inmates they felt didn't understand what was acceptable behavior. But Dorothy Thompson, aka Convict 86388, was not simply any inmate. She was Melba Newton George, a reporter with the Houston Post, and received prior approval from the Texas Prison Board and the prison system's general manager to enter the prison on an undercover assignment. OJS Ellingson and by the general manager OJS Ellingson. They provided conviction papers that were signed by a judge to the prison admission team so she could be booked in true undercover status. And then, of course, she started taking notes. "You better not get smart again or I'll spank your beep," the captain told her unknowingly. "Say, you're so big and strong, I think I'll put you out with some of the others digging ditches." The threats from Captain Heath and the treatment resultant of her sassing Mrs. Heath led the reporter to decide to leave the prison system much sooner than her original plan, which was to stay at Goree for 2 weeks in order to get her story about prison life and those of some of the women incarcerated. That first night, as she lay with the others in the syphilitic dormitory, because she had not yet received the results of her own test, Melba wrote a letter to OJS Ellingson and let him know of her experiences so far, and was allowed to, per the rules posted on the wall for all the inmates to see. She sealed it shut before she sent it. The other inmates watched and whispered among themselves of the trouble she was going to get into. Confident that her letter would arrive unhindered, she went through the morning as scheduled, noting that a Houston Chronicle correspondent visited our sewing shops, and I think secretly enjoyed the thoughts of how I was scooping him. After the inmates were given their lunch, Melba was called into the office where she hoped Ellingson would be waiting with the other prison officials, but it was only Captain Heath and his wife. They'd seen she'd sent a sealed letter to Ellingson and they didn't like it one bit. What'd you want to write to the general manager for? You must have a complaint of some kind. Melba wasn't yet ready to blow her cover, so she was vague about her reasons for writing, to which they said, Dorothy, you're so smart, I think I'm going to put you in solitary confinement. Well, okay, now she's ready to blow her cover. She explained to Captain and Mrs. Heath who she was, what she was doing there, and how she'd arranged it with the prison system and Ellingson. Unfortunately, her disguise had been way too thorough, and they didn't believe her. So having been thoroughly briefed by the other inmates on the horrors of solitary confinement and knowing that she'd told them her story plainly, Melba refused to go to Sol, as it was called, and the conflict ended with her being dragged off to solitary confinement cell block, where she stayed for several days on the floor with a thin blanket, being fed stale water and 1 slice of bread per day, bread that Rebel Childs, who we'll talk about in a few minutes, later described as being, quote, alive with maggots, unquote, for the entire time she was at Goree. Several days into her Sol stint, a visiting doctor believed what Melba imploringly told him and looked into it for her. After her story checked out with Ellingson and discovering that the name Dorothy Thompson, her undercover alias, only belatedly ever reached Ellingson, so he didn't know which one she was going to be, what the name was, Melba was finally brought out of confinement, but not before the disbelieving Captain Heath telephoned and verified everything with the judge whose name appeared on the false conviction papers. I mean, one can only imagine what would have been going through the minds of Captain and Mrs. Heath as they returned her belongings and like proceeded to give her, I think it was like a VIP guest tour of the prison. Awkward. So Melba Newton George's 2-part expose made the front page of the Houston Post on October 11th, 1937, 5 days after she entered the prison. While she did write extensively about the prison surroundings and the impressions made by the inmates and their stories, usually very nice accounts, she also recounted in luring, humiliating detail the bullying tactics she'd experienced at the hands of Captain Heath. After all, they thought she was just another inmate, and her experience was of no account to them. Okay, I'm going to go back to the Goree girls because I just wanted to give you an in-depth look at how at the operations that were undergoing for the Goree girls. I wanted to paint a picture of what these girls were going back into and how they ended up in the prison system and why they ended up doing music. Okay, so I've told you about 30 Minutes Behind the Walls, and I've told you about what the prisons are like. So now let's talk about the Goree All-Girls String Band. Although no extant recordings have been located, as I explained earlier, by all accounts, the crowning jewel of 30 Minutes was the extraordinary Goree All-Girls String Band, known as the Goree Girls. As one might expect, however, they had no musical experience prior to their incarceration. I think one of them had sung in like some little honky-tonks in Louisiana. In any case, the prison matron's daughter taught them rudimentary music skills, such as reading sheet music. The radio show was already going, it had been going for a little while, and then they decided that it would be a really great idea to get some of the women involved, and so Mrs. Heath helped arrange all this. Male inmates taught the women some basics on their particular instruments, but overall the women were responsible themselves for rehearsing and developing their skills enough to be able to appear on 30 Minutes. And of course, this isn't an easy feat because on top of the stuff I described earlier about how they're, how they're kept, they had 10-hour work days. And they rehearsed, except on Wednesdays. They didn't rehearse. They rehearsed after these 10-hour work days. And then on Wednesdays, they were allowed to rehearse all day before the dress rehearsal, the floor show, and then finally the radio program. So to be a performer on 30 Minutes, as well as being an inmate, was akin to keeping a second job. For most accounts, though, the inmates who were able to participate embraced it as a privilege and an opportunity. One might think that the Goree girls, incarcerated for years to come, likely longed for a chance to create some positive memories and improve their own image, let's say as an accomplished, attractive hillbilly band, as you see on the slide here, rather than be known for the infamy of their criminal histories. For example, inmate anecdotes reveal that the Goree girls themselves spearheaded the approach to their visual representation with hand-sewn outfits. Apparently the ones you see on here, they hand-sewed them themselves. In fact, we have verification that they did. and suitably Western accessories. Although how much consideration and calculation they applied to the social messages of the music isn't clear. Like, they wanted to be cowgirls, and probably not inmates, understandably. The variety of songs they performed consisted most entirely of popular Western and hillbilly songs of the 1930s, such as Rex Griffin's The Last Letter, Stuart Hamblin's Texas Plains, and WLS star Patsy Montana's I Want to Be a Cowboy Sweetheart. Country music motifs are, of course, rife with a variety of yearnings, including those of the prisoner who longs to be free. The simplistic universal appeal of country music meant that a listener could interpret many of its themes, like freedom to roam or freedom to go home, from more than one perspective. And I wanted to give you an example of one of the inmates within the Goree Girls through which a transformation in the prison through the musical program was paramount for her release. Every inmate in the bands, of course, had her criminal history and her stories, and I found a lot of them, and they're very fascinating. But a few stand out, particularly the story of Goree Girls string band member Rebel Childs, who in October of 1936 walked into the penitentiary with a 25-year sentence and a public who abhorred her. Through the power of the radio program, though, she did emerge from those same prison doors just a few years later with the world on her side. She grew up in rural Shelby County, Texas, and left her family at 17 to marry a prominent local man 12 years her senior, who was named Marley James Childs. Marley suffered from polio, which had somewhat affected his mobility, and at some point in their marriage, they were talking children, and they found themselves on opposite sides, which caused friction. And then several years into the unit, young, beautiful Rebel fell in love with a local man named Terrence Bramlett, and they began an affair. And so this goes on for a while, and then all of a sudden, on the night of April 23rd, 1936, while brushing his teeth at the kitchen sink, Childs, her husband, was shot in the head from an outside window and died. Within a week, both of them were in custody and charged with the murder of Marley James Childs. So this is what's interesting. In news accounts, Rebel was described as an auburn-haired, comely young widow and connoted as a heartless conspirator who murdered her invalid husband, a decent, upstanding man in cold blood. Photos from this time show a stylishly dressed, affluent young woman, which probably didn't benefit her claims of innocence, the front page in pearls, you know. Multiple newspaper articles reported Rebel as smiling and at ease after telling officers of the assassination plot, and some sexualized her image a lot. Not surprisingly, the jury found Rebel and Terrence guilty of first-degree murder with malice, but not before considering the death penalty for both. They didn't end up going with the death penalty, but Bramlett was sentenced to 50 years in the Texas State Prison, and Rebel was sentenced to 25. Now, despite this opprobrious reputation, despite all the things that we could talk about if we had time about whether or not she was guilty of this and whether or not she deserved 25 years in prison if she did not actually pull the trigger, Rebel quickly rose within the prison's microcosmic hierarchy. She became an inmate trustee and a star performer on 30 Minutes and a columnist for the Texas Prison Echo Goree Gossip Corner across the back fence. In this column, Rebel frequently spoke of the radio program and its impact on herself and her fellow inmates, keeping the tone suitably light and inoffensive. Here's a quote from Rebel in the newspaper. "We glow with pride when we remind you that some of the outstanding talent comes from this unit. Helen Rogers, Ella Ray, Ruby Morris, Eleanor Dale, and our blues crooning colored girl, Hattie. They're so unassuming in our midst that we pass them unconcernedly 6 days a week. But when we hear them on the air, it's different. They're stars then, shining in our own little sky above our backyard, and we clasp hands on the back porch to dream little dreams that are made of stardust." It's a beautiful image. But then there's the maggots in the bread. Anyway, in 1940, Rebel conducted an on-air interview with 30 Minutes Behind the Walls. Now, gone was this comely young widow that had appeared on all of the Jezebel, that they literally called her a Jezebel, that had been in the newspapers, etc. And they had fixated on her. And in her place was this industrious, hopeful, musically talented young woman who only wanted to work hard and earn an honest way in life so that her heart could be light again. I mean, it's possible some regional listeners of the show recalled who she was, but it was 2 years ago before the show began. And national listeners probably weren't familiar with her case, even though some of the national papers picked up the story because it was an interesting crime story. Instead of addressing her crime or punishment in her interview, Rebel spoke with enthusiasm of the radio show and how it gave the girls in white hope for freedom and forgiveness. She says, WBAP has given us a nice dream. I mean, a dream of the future. If the public is interested in us while we are imprisoned, it stands to reason that their interest will go with us when we leave here. We believe that we shall find happiness somewhere, that our mistakes won't be held against us, that we will be given another chance. So, it's really wonderful how she was talking about the radio show, and I really believe that they enjoyed it. That doesn't mean that they weren't still pawns of the Texas prison system as they worked. So I just want to kind of give you a little sense of how often they worked, what their situation was. So dreamy interviews aside, the Goree all-girl string band worked an insane schedule at the height of their popularity. Trotted out for functions, from fiddlers' fests to state dinners and state fairs and rodeos. The band's tour route in the fall of 1941 provides insight into their demanding schedule. They were sent out of the prison on tour for almost all of 1941 and 42. Often accompanied by their male counterparts, the rhythmic stringsters, the Goree all-girl string band played the rodeo in Teague, Texas on September 29th, the county fair and rodeo in Pittsburgh on September 30th, then traveled back to Huntsville to perform on 30 Minutes on October 1st. Shows in Bartlett, Crockett, Schulenburg followed between October 2nd and 4th, and then the girls returned to Huntsville again for the annual Texas Prison Rodeo, so they could open the prison rodeo on Sunday, October 5th. After the following Wednesday's 30 Minutes performance on October 8th, the girls then went to Marlin, Palestine, and Groveston, Texas from the 9th to the 11th, and arrived back in Huntsville to play the prison rodeo again, as well as an additional performance at the Wynn unit of the Texas prison on October 12th. So that's like one show a day for almost 2 weeks. It's crazy. I've been a musician. I am a musician. I know I've toured, and that's an insane schedule. Indeed, the bands played so frequently that Prison Echo columnist Rebel Childs called it, quote, an epidemic of sore fingers and thumbs while preparing for the rodeo. Owing to heavy practice and rehearsing, plus the many times we have played at various places in the past few weeks, she wrote, we will have to carry a first aid kit well stocked with arnica, collodion, and new skin. Performing on 30 Minutes required a staggering amount of time and commitment each week, but also as inmates, the Goree girls did seem to be it seemed unlikely that they were motivated by a love of music or a love of performing. Rather, participation on 30 Minutes and the subsequent road trip shows held personal importance to them for other reasons. Like prison officials, inmates viewed being in a band as valuable vocational training. Touring provided precious opportunities to temporarily experience the outside world, real food, actual ride on a Ferris wheel. I think a couple of them talked about this ride on a Ferris wheel that meant so much to them because they had to go back to their cells and their maggot bread. Appearances on the show led also to public recognition, and some types brought gifts of money from fans that could be used for clemency appeals. They were allowed to keep some of that money that came to them specifically. Performing on the show probably also gave them the personal thrill and therapeutic effects of accomplishment. But, of course, above all, the Goree girls and the Rhythmic Stringsters and many of the other bands, their definition of success was not stardom, no matter how exciting the experience may have been. As World War II raged on and rationing began, the touring was abandoned, and the inmates were expected to provide new material for the show each week. But as would be expected in a prison, member turnover became a constant issue. The players changed as sentences were served and clemencies granted, and many clemencies were granted as a result of good behavior with the radio show. Even so, in a multitude of incarnations, the female band of Goree State Farm continued for actually nearly another 3 decades after they officially began in 1940. Media acknowledgement and photographs of the Goree Girls Band have been found as late as 1968, and in 1960, legendary stripper/burlesque star Candy Barr sang with the Goree Girls as she served a couple of years for a marijuana-related conviction. And even in 1959, was given a hysterectomy in the prison without her consent. So it happened, and it happened later. She wrote about that in her biography. During the years that 30 Minutes aired, though, the Goree all-girl string band achieved bona fide stardom on the radio. You heard earlier me talking about how successful they were, even though there was a cat on the back of the chair. They had so many thousands of letters. But through the years, with their performances of familiar songs about home and fireside and the wide Western Trail, the Goree girls experienced overwhelming support and empathy and admiration from a national public that in the lean years after the U.S. joined the Second World War was revising its opinion of the criminal element just a little bit. Progressivism had happened, and they had started to release the inmates to join the armed forces and so on. And a large part of it, as the officials of Texas prison system had hoped, it really worked to improve their image. A large part of the change appeared to be a result of radio broadcasts in the form of this type. And for all the all-girl bands in the Texas prison system, of course, hope came in the form of their music and their country music, which provided a blissful, even if temporary, escape from the chains that bound them. But despite their popularity, I'm just going to conclude here, despite their popularity through the radio show, an understanding can be gleaned that to the inmates of the Texas prison system, their definition of success was not at all to become radio stars. Above all, their primary desire was to regain personal autonomy in the form of clemency through early parole or a pardon. Success on 30 Minutes was the key to realizing this desire and represented an opportunity to convince the public and the government of their worthiness to be set free. Performing music on the radio was not the reason these prisoners were set free, but it served as their inspiration and their salvation, if you will. Prisoners needed that, even that temporary inspiration and salvation desperately, as did so many of the free world listeners during the 1930s and 40s. So I'm hoping that perhaps one day we'll recover some of the music they made so that things won't be forgotten. But I'm part of my job here as a historian and as somebody who has researched this for many years is to make sure that people don't forget it. And it's also my opinion that it might do some good for the Texas prison system to recall a time themselves when they understood the power and the possibilities of rehabilitation as well. The Amarillo and Daily News had a compelling point in 1940 when they wrote that radio has gone behind prison walls and messaged to the outside world the almost forgotten fact that men and women behind the bars are human, that they have feeling. This changing attitude could well make for reform instead of punishment, and the prison problem is a public problem. And that concludes my presentation for today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Caroline. That's fascinating. I have a few questions for you. The story is, I wish it was better known. This would make a terrific movie.
I know, or a TV series with the inmate backstories and all that.
Right.
Yeah.
Tell me more about the sterilization. Do we know why that was done?
Yes. I think that, well, first of all, let me preface everything that I'm about to say with a statement that the Texas Department of Criminal Justice has never stated that they did this, has never admitted that they did this, even though I found evidence. I looked and looked for evidence, but according to our former warden and some other people who I talked to that knew about the prison and the records, they were all tossed in the bottom of the river, all the medical records. So I just want to preface that because what I don't want, I've always thought maybe I could secretly get in trouble with the Texas Department of Criminal Justice by saying that they did this. So I just want to preface, they have never stated that they did this, and I'm not going to say outright that they did, but the evidence is overwhelming. And a lot of it stemmed from, you're dealing with two aspects here. You're dealing with prisons and you're dealing with female women, both of which were marginalized populations. In the 1920s, this gentleman named Carl Baslin came up with came up with a classification system for his inmates, for all of the inmates of the Texas prison system, so that they could be housed appropriately. Part of it was progressively, the intent was progressively to place them with like people, so that somebody who was a first-time offender who hadn't done a lot, hadn't done much to get there, didn't end up being in a cell with a murderer or something along those lines, like a serial killer or something. But they really classified them by age, by race. They definitely classified them by gender, and those classifications, they had some classifications that were kind of, for lack of a better word, in sympathy or along the lines of the eugenics system of the 1930s, where they had inmates that they believed were feeble-minded or I'm trying to remember the word, but they were sort of easily led. The word's escaping me right now, but anyway, so I believe that they categorized women into that category and believed them not really capable of making their own decisions. Women had only just 10 years before, 20 years before gotten the vote. So they were considered second class, sort of, and as such, I think these were, they thought that they were, the word, incorrigible. Incorrigible.
Like an incorrigible woman.
Yes, they were incorrigible. They had done so much. They had done everything. They had done these crimes that landed them in the prison, and as such, they did not deserve to be. I think that was the general assumption, that they did not deserve as a whole to be treated fairly, and so they were provided because they could reproduce. And I don't know, I'm assuming that there were instances where prison guards would rape them. I haven't really found a lot of that, but I'm certain it happened. But the women were also at that time, by the time Mrs. Heath came around, I know that happened earlier in the prison system for certain. The Goree farm was built in 1937, so after that time they were kind of segregated, and they had a matron who looked after them, and there was a lot more, I think there was a little more protection with Mrs. Heath and the subsequent female wardens and female matrons of the system. But they did do it, I think, because I looked up the newspapers, and I noticed in the Goree columns that they would write, oh, so-and-so is out for surgery. And it was like not long after the prison records noted that person had been admitted. Also, several of the women's relatives, they never had children, and their relatives told them that several independent stories about that it happened. And then there was one exception. There were a couple of exceptions of children. These women didn't have any children after they left the prison system. There was one woman that I found that had a child before she entered into the prison system. And then the other exception that I'm aware of, at least at this time, I don't know if it went on consistently up until the 50s with Candy Bar, if she was particularly incorrigible because she'd made enemies of a lot of people in Dallas. But I think that the sterilization did occur. And so, yeah.
Well, I have one more question, and then we'll wrap it up. But in an earlier conversation with you, you mentioned that these women got fan mail from all over. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that WBAP was a very strong station, and depending on the atmosphere, other countries could get this music.
Yes.
Can you tell us about Japan?
I don't know about Japan. I do know.
Was somebody received a gift from abroad, you said?
Yes, that is true. Japan, I don't know of any instances with Japan specifically. I heard of letters and fan mail from Guam, where the U.S. was stationed. I'm sure that, I don't know if they were even stationed in Guam at that time, but in any case, yeah, the gift in question, Rebel, luckily, the situation with Rebel and why I talk about her is because she was a person, her person and her gestalt was she was very likable, very lovable. There's very little, there's very few people who thought that she even did the crime that she needed, that she didn't know anything about it, that happened, that got her in there. And as a result, because she was very genteel, well-spoken, polite, pretty and so on, she really became embraced by even the captain, the matron, and his wife and so on. They sort of became friends. They had her over to dinner and stuff like that. So she was a favorite inmate, and she did not have a hysterectomy. I think that they would have, but she became a favorite inmate very early on, and so she did not have one. And as a result, she had a daughter after she got out of prison. And that story, her whole backstory is super fascinating, especially that when she got out of prison, the person whom she married and her daughter, but her daughter has these gifts. Our daughter has possession of these gifts that were sent to her from Egypt, and I've seen them, and they're incredible. They're like necklace stands, like jewelry stands, and bracelets and stuff, and you can tell it's a fine early 20th century fine quality item. And so yeah, they did get gifts because I've seen them.
It's such a fascinating story, and I really thank you for your participation in the conference on Texas. I hope everybody will get a copy of your book and read more about this amazing story that you uncovered. So thank you again for your participation.
No problem. My pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for having me. And I hope everyone out there stays safe and healthy.